Thank you. Can I have the remote and my, yeah. I want to start by thanking the leaders of the Academy and the staff for the hard work that you put into putting together such a wonderful workshop. And as was discussed by the two colleagues before me, the issue of Anthropocene, which is not my expertise, is whether we like it or not, there to be discussed and tackled. But when we say Anthropocene, we are saying obviously it's different from the Holocene, which is different from the Pleistocene, which is different from the Pliocene, Miocene, Oligocene, et cetera, because the Earth has a long history. And what I'm going to try to do today is to actually talk about what happened, not even in the Holocene, but before that. Because we, Homo sapiens, are a lone survivor of a long lineage, a diverse lineage. And I think looking back into human adaptation and evolution in that time frame is part of addressing the complex question of Anthropocene, because we are trying to define the Anthropocene, gauging it against the Holocene. We are saying it's different. So what happened in the Pleistocene is what I will try to shed light on, but it's going to be a big picture because this represents millions of years. Unlocking the past obviously is key to better understand the present and the future. And this was exemplified recently by the work of Svante Pääbo, who got the 2022 Nobel Prize for really decoding the Neanderthal genome. So understanding the cousin species and other many species that have existed in the Pleistocene is already shedding light on what could potentially happen to us, even applications to medicine. Of course, it will take some time, but I just want to highlight that. But the DNA and fossil evidence, and I work on fossils, not only tells us that we are survivors of a long lineage, but are closely related to living species, such as the chimpanzees and gorillas. And many of you know that we share over 98% of our genetic makeup with the chimpanzees. So we have commonality with many other species. So it's important to recognize that. Maybe a little further would be the gorillas, a little further the orangs, and then the mammals and the reptiles. You go all the way to the origin of life, and other experts maybe can tell us more about that. In fact, this fact was already noticed by Darwin, who actually did not have the benefit of the genetic and the fossil evidence. He only had the knowledge of the similarities between African great apes humans morphologically, and he predicted that one day, this is in 1871, one day, our early ancestors will be found in Africa, and guess what? That's what happened. In fact, this very basic fact was also noticed by the non-experts, such as Queen Victoria, who, upon visiting an orangutan, said, wow, this looks like frightfully, painfully, and disagreeably human. And she's right. They do look like us, both behaviorally, morphologically, and genetically. But today, it's not about asking the question of whether we look like this one or that one. It's really about the challenges that we have, the rising population size. We shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzees only 7 million years ago. And today, there are only 200,000 chimpanzees, but there is a whopping 8 billion humans. Clearly, that already tells you something in terms of how both unique and strange creatures that we are. But I think this picture that you see is even more striking when you remember that we are primates, and primates are tropical species. They should remain within the tropics. You should not go north and south of the tropics. Well, you can go to Alaska or come to Chicago in the winter, and I'll tell you that you don't belong there, because if you remove your clothing or you turn on the heater, you don't belong there. So the fact that we have this ability to occupy not only our planet, go to a population size of 8 billion people is unprecedented, clearly. In fact, if you focus on the great apes, to which we are closely related, our geographic range is even more limited. And furthermore, if you look at just African apes, because we are African apes, we should simply stay in that part of Africa, like the chimpanzees and the gorillas. That's where we belong. But of course, that's not the case. So something has happened, and that needs to be discussed. Hence, the importance of the discussion on Anthropocene and other important issues. If you were like me, you go back in time. It was only 2 million years ago that creatures who look like us, Homo erectus, ventured out of Africa for the first time 2 million years ago. They reached Georgia, China, Java, and other parts of Asia after 2 million years ago. No other hominin species, no other human ancestor has ventured into Australia and the Americas except our species. So clearly, even those species that are closely related to us in the past, like Homo erectus, were not able to venture into the Americas and Australia, for example. It was only maybe 70,000 years ago where Homo sapiens, people like you and I, went out of Africa and populated the Americas and Australia for the first time. The Americas won't be colonized up until 15 to 10,000 years ago. So this species that we call Homo sapiens had a trajectory that commences in Africa, goes out and occupies this huge planet. And as they were doing it, I think it's important, the impact of climate. And in the following video, what I'll show you is how climate change, the changing ice sheet cover, land bridges have facilitated or served as a barrier as our ancestors were moving around. Meaning, our ancestors were mediated, their migration were mediated or modulated, rather than our ancestors really impacting the planet to the extent that we see it today. So you will see that we will emerge in Africa sometime around 200, 300,000 years ago and migrate within Africa. And for thousands of years, deserts and oceans were barriers to human migration out of Africa. The first migration we tried was 100,000 years ago. It went up to the Levant, but we couldn't continue. And you will see that there will be another migration around 17,000 years ago. But notice that the ice sheet is fluctuating. So all these migrations of our populations are going to be modulated by the changing climate, broadly defined, of course. And we will encounter the Neanderthals, and that's why many of you here will have a piece of DNA from the Neanderthals, as was shown by the person I mentioned earlier. Again, my bottom line here is it's the fact that instead of us impacting the planet, this is, of course, our ancestors, in a dramatic fashion, you will see that they're migrating east-west and north-south, because it's easier to go east-west within the tropics for a tropical species. It's much later that you actually go to Europe. You go to Asia first, which is weird, because that's where you feel comfortable. And of course, today our species is impacting, as was highlighted by Francine and Jorgen, in a dramatic way. So, repeating what I said earlier again, therefore, our adaptation and migration patterns were largely mediated by climatic conditions. And I'm not suggesting that our ancestors were just innocent and not damaging the other fauna and flora, because in Australia and South Africa, South America and North America, they practically decimated the large fauna there. Whether people like Jorgen and Francine think about those issues, well, that's an expert's opinion, but I'm not saying they were completely innocent. They were doing damage also. So they decimated the megafauna. And today, clearly, we have occupied the entire planet. We are on the moon. By the way, it should not be man on the moon, it should be humans on the moon, and then looking for more. So in the following slides, what I will do is, how did we do this? Looking back in time. what were the successive adaptations of our lineage, this long lineage that after we separated from the chimpanzees 7 million years ago, what happened? Because we just didn't plop out of nothing there. So the first event will be we separated from the chimpanzees with whom we share a common ancestor around 7 million years ago. Of course, I don't need to say that we don't descend from chimpanzees. And we became upright walkers. This bipedal walking is an important hallmark stage in our evolution, which would lead to the freeing up of the hands. When you give chimpanzees two types of food, one very nutritious and the other not, if they know that the food is nutritious, they will use all sorts of hands and mouths and everything to capture as much fruit as possible. And I think a behavior like that is probably at the base of our behavior for tool making. And by 2.5 million years ago, you have stone tools like the one, what we call chopper, which will be replaced by the Australian technology, bifaces, and then more sophisticated technology, especially after 50,000 years ago. And for me, we will talk a lot about AI. AI is nothing but an extension in sophistication of this so-called primitive technology that emerged maybe 3 million years ago. But one of the most critical transitions in terms of tool use and tool making in our lineage is going to really pertain to the use of some type of symbolic tools, like putting pigmentation on your skin and other things which I will come back to later. As the stone tools are changing through time, we also see the brain size of these human ancestors is expanding. Starting from around 4.5 million years ago, you have a chimpanzee-like brain size. It goes to the whopping 1,400 cc brain size you and I have today on average. So you see stone tools are improving, and our brain size is also becoming bigger and bigger. We call it encephalization. And then you will see the birth of our species in Africa, as I mentioned earlier, sometime around 300,000 years ago. And we call these guys anatomically modern Homo sapiens intentionally, because we will see the behaviorally modern Homo sapiens, which will have also their own characteristics. By anatomically modern Homo sapiens, what we are saying is if you look at the face, there are derived features like the presence of a chin, not prominent brow, small teeth, et cetera, of course, big brain, even though the Neanderthals also had as large of a brain as humans, but they have unique features also. The transition from the anatomical to behavioral modernity is really what is going to probably transform our species, in my opinion. And that is the species becomes not just interested in consuming, in eating, or in the basic necessities of the bodies and the calories, but they start to use ochre and beads and paintings maybe 70,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. There is a debate there as to whether modernity emerged after 50,000 years ago abruptly, like Richard Klein would say, or is a gradual process that was born in Africa, and I'll come back to that. But the transition from this anatomically modern Homo sapiens that are morphologically like you and I to the modern Homo sapiens who are further interested in things beyond calories, I would call it, is going to be fundamental. And that's what actually gives them the imagination to venture into other kinds of environments, like forested environment, snowy conditions, and other environmental conditions that would be unheard of for a tropical species, which I discussed earlier. So this is just a bit maybe jargonish, but if you look at the archaeology of Africa, before 50,000 years ago or so, you will have flake technologies. You don't really see as much of symbolic artifacts like the ochres and the pigmentation and all that. You don't see long-distance transfer of raw material, and you don't really see aquatic resources being used. And this is largely shared with the Neanderthals, and that's what we call the Middle Stone Age in Africa and the Middle Paleolithic technology in Europe. So Neanderthals and humans, even though they were in different parts of the world, they shared pretty much similar technology, especially before 50,000 years ago. What is going to be transformative is that you will see sometime maybe after 50,000 years ago, you will have the blade technology, symbolic art, long-distance transfer of raw material, aquatic resources, and especially projectile weaponry that becomes part of the archaeological landscape. And that is probably uniquely human, which according to some will have, I think it emerged in Africa for sure, but it would have evolved gradually for some, but it would have abruptly happened in Africa and then moved to Europe for others. I lean to the former, but that's not the story here. What I'm trying to say is, so what caused the transition from the anatomically to behaviorally modern Homo sapiens is a question that I'm asking. One group will tell you there was a punctuated late African origin for this technology, the pigmentations, the weaponries of projectile resource using aquatic resources, et cetera, et cetera. So according to this hypothesis, the origin of modern human behavior is seen as punctuated event, and the behaviorally modern traits are considered to have arrived as a package, all of it at the same time in Africa. Then this model would compress the evolution of modern human behavior in Africa, the migration of modern humans outside of Africa to conquer the world, and the extinction of archaic hominins such as the Neanderthals. Really compressed in a span of 10,000 years ago. That's one hypothesis. And the second one, and they disagree, they support a more gradual change pointing to what they call 3 pillars of human uniqueness. And that is an evolved and advanced cognition, hyper-prosociality, I'll come back to that, and ability for social learning. And these properties are foundational for what we call cumulative culture. Cumulative culture meaning culture that would continue to get transmitted through generations, which is the dominant adaptation of our species. And these traits were in place, according to those who disagree with the former, 200 and 100,000 years ago. But they were not as ubiquitous as you would see them at around 50,000 years ago. I tend to concur with these because you do see evidence for symbolism, weaponry, and all that earlier in Africa, 100,000, 200, maybe 70,000, 100,000 years ago, even though it's not going to be as ubiquitous as it would be after 50,000 years ago. And the notion of hyper-prosociality is nothing but this penchant that we have for cooperation with unrelated individuals. And the human uniqueness that they call human uniqueness is our ability for peerless collaboration while being ruthless competitors. So what they're implying is we're very good to collaborate with non-related people, but then we are also highly competitive when it comes to it, which led to the sudden rise of our world domination. So when you have a projectile weapon added to a hyper-prosocial and hyper-competitive behavior, a spectacular behaviorally new creature, or Homo sapiens, was born. That's what they suggest. And Neanderthals would be perceived as competitors. Of course, we did interbreed with them, as we know it genetically. But of course, we may have contributed to their demise as well. Okay. And I want to underscore that we have lived with many species at multiple times, and we were not alone. And finally, I asked the question, why are we the lone survivor today? And what happened to the many species that have existed over the time? I guess that those questions are great. They shed light on the issue of what will happen to our species going forward, which is the issue of Anthropocene, and of course, the role of AI. Thank you.